Hi, Ben here and welcome back. Today we are down at the hedgerow which we planted right at the bottom of our field. We planted this probably about 12 years ago. It was a very mature old hedge with very big trees and then big gaps. So we ended up coppicing all those big trees and then planting it up with some native hedgerow species. So we've got some hawthorn, we've got some blackthorn, we've got some spindle, we've got some guelder rose, we've got some dog rose, a real nice mixture. As you can probably see, the hawthorn has already started to burst. It is actually probably technically a little bit late in the season to be laying hedges, but it's life at the end of the day, so we're having to do it when we've had a break in the weather. Obviously, if you've got a very thick, dense hedge, the reason why you don't do it this time of year is basically because of nesting birds, but as you can see, we can actually see into the hedgerow and make sure that there's no nests and no nesting birds. So we're going to lay a little bit of it because it was getting too, even at this stage, 12 years old, it was starting to get a bit too big. Some of the trees were getting overgrown basically, and it was starting to get very gappy at the base again. So we'll show you what we've been up to and show you how you go about actually laying a hedge. So this end was very dark, very overgrown, and we had a massive bramble patch the other side that had climbed up the hedge and I'd actually killed one of the trees at the far end. It actually just totally shaded out. So the first task was to get all the brambles clear, and then what we've done is we've thinned it out quite a bit. We've taken out some of the really big trees and we've actually kept some of the younger stems, and we've actually started to lay them. Now the technique of laying them is you cut through them, leaving just a very small piece of bark and cambium at the very front end, and that will allow the tree to bend, almost fold over on that, but still be connected to the rootstock, so it's still going to grow. So the technique really is that you want to lay it, if you've got a slope, you always want to lay it uphill so that the sap can flow uphill. It doesn't like it if you lay it downwards. And we want to try and keep it at least a sort of 30-degree angle. And we put stakes in just to help support those pleachers or these stems. We put the stakes in to just keep that angle so that they don't go flat. And obviously, being in Herefordshire, we get quite a strong wind coming from that direction, so putting those stakes in will stop those pleachers getting blown off and breaking off the stem. So we've done a little section already. It's quite amazing how much wood you have to take out. We've managed to get enough stakes out of the actual hedgerow again, which is really good, and we've also gathered a lot of firewood which we're going to season, and that'll be fuel for our fire during the winter months. So we've come down to this section of the hedge. We've already laid these few bits of spindle in front of us, and now we're going to work on this piece of hawthorn. So I've sided it up, so made sure that it's not tangled at the top. You want to make sure you cut off any branches that are maybe woven into the other hedge, because you want this to be free. That's the main factor. And this is about the perfect diameter that we can still pleach this and still lay it with hand tools. So I'm going to use my bill hook. This is a really nice pattern because it hasn't got a very pronounced sort of hook to it. This is perfect for hedge laying because you're not going to stick it in the dirt. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to strike into the stem, probably start maybe, what's that, about 8-9 inches above the stem. And we're going to be laying it in this direction. So I cut on this side of the stem. I'm going to strike in, maybe at about sort of 30 degrees. And what I tend to do is I give it then a little bit of a pull, and I'm going to try and sort of force that stem to split. You can see how it started to crack almost straight away. This is still too thick at this moment though, so strike back in there again. And the reason why we use a bill hook is you can see that I'm actually using it for like a lever as well at the same right. So we want that split to run, and we gently lay it down. Now if you've got your apprentice, they'll be at the other end just to help let that stem come down onto the hedge. And this is about perfect really. What you want is you want that stem to bend without the split cracking back up the stem. You want this nice gentle taper. You want the crack not to ideally run into the soil because you want to prevent any kind of infection going in there. And then what we'll do is we'll come in here with probably with the pull saw, and we'll cut this sort of lip off the backside of this pleacher. And where we cut it, that will allow fresh growth to come up from there. And anywhere that you've cut stems on this pleacher, it will start to throw up new stems and new growth. Even from these little areas here, these little buds will be stimulated, and it will put a lot of fresh growth. And that's part of the idea of laying the hedge is that you're thickening up the base of the hedge. If you let it just get bigger and bigger and bigger, you'll have all the growth at the top. You'll have a big hole at the bottom of your hedge and the lambs and things will still get through. So this is going to really thicken up the base of the hedge and make it easy to maintain. So these little pull saws are great for this task. You can get really nice and low to the floor. You can get a really nice clean cut. So go steady, because you don't want to cut into that living sort of lip that we're leaving for the feature to survive. Give it a little lever like so. Clean off any little whiskers. Maybe just go in there with a bill hook. Just tidy that up a little bit. There you go, just like so. So what we want to try and do is leave that really nice smooth cut to stimulate that growth, but also to shed any rain and water and things like that. So that's about perfect. So we've got the seal of approval from the little ladybird, obviously doing some good. And the nice thing about working out in the woods with hand tools is you can still hear the birds tweeting and see the nature all around you. So the next stem to lay is much bigger diameter. So you've got a few options. You could use a saw to cut at an angle, but it's quite tedious cutting down the grain. You could use an axe, or you can use a bigger bill hook. So this is a Yorkshire bill hook. This is double-sided. It's got a pronounced hook on this side, which is great for catching any branches when you're snedding up the side of the hedge. But this side is dead straight. Now this is perfect because I can swing this with two hands, get a lot more power, a lot more heft behind it, and hopefully we'll be able to lay this pleacher over. So make sure that you clear any of the growth from below it so that you're not kneeling on any spikes, and then we'll swing this in. So I'm using it two-handed and I'm making some chops. I'm still going for that same sort of angle that I went for last time. And once I've got a little ways into the stem, I can use the hook again as a lever to try and drive it over. If you find that it's not going, you might need to lengthen that slice, so come a bit higher to get that angle that you need. The trouble is when they get big as well, the bark tends to get a little bit dry and they get a little bit sort of almost brittle. So you have to be a bit careful that you don't make it too thin too soon. Hey, there you go. So now I can push it and I can thin that stem. There you go. We got there in the end. We can just gently lay that down onto those other pleachers. Sometimes you might need to trim some of the branches so that it sits nicely. This is still a little bit of a mess. So what I might even do in this instance is this stem that's coming out at a funny angle, because there's a bit of a gap there in the hedge, you can actually pleach those as well. So we can pleach that in, tuck that into the hedge itself, hold that in place with a stake, and then this one we can use the Yorkshire bill hook again to trim off that spur, and again that will stimulate that growth that we're after as well. So I've earned my cup of tea now, I think, with that one. So we're going to get some stakes in the hedge now to hold those pleachers in place. So we've got some hazel, and we'll just put a quick point on these, taking any bend out the stake by sort of pointing the right side. And then I've got my trusty club. And what we want to try and do is, as we feed these in, we want to sort of catch a few of the stems and sort of pull them back in line. Ideally you want it a sort of set distance. It's normally sort of like arm span between stakes, but it looks like I'm going to hit this great big stool of this big pleacher down there, so hopefully I can get it in, but we'll see what oh, that's not too bad. and we put them at a slight angle. That sort of helps keep those pleachers up at that sort of 30-degree angle. And then we have those stakes, and then when we finally finish the hedge, we'll go along with these long rods, either hazel or willow, and we'll bind the top of the hedge, which is what we call heathering, or binders for putting on the top of the hedge, and that holds it all nicely in place. But I'll maybe point another one and get another stake in, and then we'll lay a few more pleachers. So we got that big pleacher down and we've got some stakes in, but unfortunately this little patch here, because there was quite a lot of growth coming off that big hawthorn and this hazel, the few little whips that we'd actually planted 12 years ago have actually died off basically. So we've got quite a big gap now. So if we just go straight to laying these, the actual hedge itself will get very flat and it will probably die. So in this instance what we do is we use what we call dead hedging. So you can use some of the tips that you've cut off some of the stems that you don't need. And we're going to place those into the ground, push them in a good ways. And what that's going to do is going to act as like a support basically to keep the angle of the pleachers at about 30 degrees. So you don't have to put them in at the same angle, because as those come down, they'll sort of flatten it. So stick them in the ground. You never know, being this time of the year, they might even take, you never know. They might start to root. So this is going to be our little cushioning sort of little area for those pleachers to lay on. So I'll cut a few more and get them in those little gaps, then we can start bringing some of these nice clean long hazel stems down. So we've just come over the fence over to another hedgerow. Now this is predominantly hazel at this top end of this hedge, and this is basically what we were saying yesterday. If you don't manage a hedge, you don't lay it, the stools get bigger and the gaps get bigger. So you can see there's a real big gap now. I mean, in this instance, if you're actually going to manage this hedge, you would probably coppice this whole thing, replant the gaps, and then come back in maybe 6 years time and actually lay some of the fresh stems that have come off those stools, and obviously the new plants that you've put in. So big old gnarly old hazel hedge, fantastic for materials though. So we've come to get some of these thinner rods. These are what we're going to use for our binders or our heatherings. So if I cut one off here, we'll show you what we're looking for. So we're looking for nice long rods. We might even incorporate this second rod that's come off the side. Maybe not, maybe it's a bit thin, but that's probably a good 10 foot long, and that's going to be a perfect binder. So all we do is just trim off those side shoots with the bill hook, and we need to probably collect maybe 20 to 24, maybe 2 dozen of these to bind the top of that hedge. So that's a really nice binder. So I'll cut through a few more. Hopefully we should be able to get them all off these couple of stools. So sometimes to get those ultimate rods, you have to make a little bit of a climb, but these majestic hazels are quite fun to climb with these big side branches. So yeah, that's a beautiful one. So we've got pretty much the end of this section of hedge that we're going to do this season. We've got this natural hole here, and we wanted to actually have a little access to get down into the bottom field, so we're going to leave that as a little opening. So pretty much staked all the way to the end. Granted, this is a bit thin because obviously there's no extra pleachers, so I have put a little bit of dead hedging in there, but this season those stools are just going to throw up fresh growth, so not too concerned about that. And we've got our binders. These are some really nice long ones. And the hazel has this particular nice rigidity about it, so it's not as floppy as some willow binders that we used the other day. So hopefully, it's a bit tricky when you're first starting because the tension only comes when you actually start weaving these. So I'm going to have to hold this end, and I'm going to start lifting these binders. I want that one to go underneath. I want this one to go over the top. So we're just putting like a natural twist into these binders themselves. And if you find that the heatherings or the binders are a bit too floppy, you can actually put like a double twist in. But just putting that one twist in between those gaps in the stakes, that's already putting that tension in. So this one is on top. So this one wants to go underneath now. So we've got to lift this through. It's a little bit tricky. Helps you when you're working with a young apprentice. But when you're doing it on your own, it's just a little bit tricky. But look at that, that's already started to tie it all together, locking all those stakes together, and that will prevent the wind from blowing those pleachers off as well. So that's looking pretty good. What I'll do is, once I've got all the binders set, I'll just go down with my mallet just to get it all pretty much at the same height, and then we'll come along and we'll just cut the tops of those stakes off and make it all look nice and neat. And when it's all bound in, we can just go along, maybe trim a few of these loose ends off. We call it siding up the hedge, so you could use that Yorkshire billock or a pair of secateurs, whatever you want really, and make it look nice and neat, and then let it do its thing. So it's just going to spend the next season growing and putting all fresh growth on where we need it really. So I'm going to carry on and get a bit more heathering done. So that's this section of hedge all finished off, binders on, and we've cut the tops of the stakes. So that's the method that we use. There's lots of different regional patterns and ways of laying a hedge. This is our particular Midlands style where you put brash either side. But yeah, I learned how to lay a hedge when I was back as an apprentice when I was 18. So I've been doing it on and off for a few years. I've had about a 10-year gap, but it's lovely to come back and actually use those skills to start laying your own hedges rather than somebody else's. So hope you got some useful information from that little video, and maybe a bit too late this season, but you'll be ready prepared for next season where you'll be able to start laying your own hedges. So thanks for watching. Remember to subscribe to the channel, and we'll see you next time.